Hey everyone. Today we are going to look into classes in C Sharp. Uh, so as you might already know, right? So C Sharp is a object-oriented language. So anything that we do in C Sharp, it's represented by a class. An object is nothing but basically it's a representation of that class in memory, right? And we can create multiple objects of a particular class. So let's take an example, right? Let's say you are trying to build a, a basically a software for a college, right? So a college would have a lot of entities, right? A college would have something called as a classroom, a teacher, and a student. So think about these things that would build a college as classes. So you would have like a class created for each of these entities, and then based on how many students that you have at a given amount of time, or how many teachers that you have, you would create n number of objects to represent that system in memory. Okay. So if you see this, right, so this is just a console application, and now even if we have just the main method, it's already inside a class, and this class is called a program. So let's create another class, a very simple class, and let's probably what I'll do is I'll right click on this project, add. So you can go from here, new item, or if you see here, right, there's already a item here in this list called as class. So I'll just click on this class. I'll probably just call it as student. Okay, so a new file has been created for me, and in this file there's a class that's created which is called as student class. Okay, so a class can have a lot of things. So a class can have something called as properties. A class can have something called as methods. So in order to create properties for a student, so so for example, if there's a student, right, what data would you want to store for that student? So probably we'll start with the name of the student, and age of the student, and let's say the university number, the ID number for that particular student. Okay. So now in order to create a property, so there's a shortcut in Visual Studio. I'll just say prop and press tab twice. So the first property, let's say it is name. So the data type for the name property should be string, and I'll just call it as name. And I'll tab again, enter. So next property, PORP, tab. I'll keep it as integer, and I'll name it as age. Last property, I'll have this property as let's say university roll number. I mean, it could be a number, or it could be I know it could be alphanumeric, uh, something alphanumeric as well, right? Probably it could start with like few alphabets and then end up with few digits. So for now, I'll just keep it as a string. So I'll say ID. I'll just call it as ID, right? Okay. Three properties that we have created for a student class. So I'll just save this. And for now, I'll just give an access specifier, right? I'll just say that this class is public. Uh, so we'll talk about access specifiers later on, but all public means is it's no, it's readable from the same namespace as well as other assemblies as well. Yeah. So I'll go back to program class. What I'll do is, now that we have a class, now we would create an object of this class. So let's say student. So I'll call it as, let's say you have two students in your whatever classroom, right? So let's say I'll create student one. Student one equals to new student. And once you create a student, you'll assign all the properties of the student. So I'll say student one dot name is to I'll just call it as Tom. And let's say 21, and student one dot ID equals to ID blah 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 something, right? So this is the definition of my student, the first student, right? So I'll just copy this So now I can create n number of objects, right? So the name of this variable has to be different. So I'll just call it as student2, call it as Jerry 22 and some other ID. Okay, so these are my two students that I've created in this main class. Okay, so this is how you access the properties of a student, right? Using a dot notation. So for example, if I say student1 dot, right, you see all the properties here, age, ID, name, and there are some methods that you see here. These are coming from the system.object class, right? That's the default class from which all the classes inherit from C#. Okay, was an example of a simple class, right? Now we have these properties. We also can create some methods. Let's say I want to create a method in this class. So I'll say public. This method should return me a string. Okay. I'll just call it as get description. Okay. A very simple method. So what I want to do is for this particular student, if I call this method, I want to get some information. I'll probably call it as get information. Some information about that particular student, right? So what I can do is I'll say string, say return string dot format. I'll say name of the student is 0. Student is this year old and their ID number is whatever 0, 1, 2, and then I'll pass. So this is the reference to the current object, right? So whoever, for example, if I create an object student1 like we just created, so if I call this method from student1, it's going to take the student1 name, age, and ID, right? So I'll say this dot name, comma, this dot age, comma, this dot ID. Let's see if this is fine, and I have to end it with a semicolon. Okay, so this looks okay to me. So I'll go back to my program.cs class. What I'll do is I'll do a console.writeLine, and I'll say student1 dot get information. Okay. So this method should return a string, and that string I want to put it on the console, right? Similarly, I'll call this for my student2. Okay, so there's an error. There's a bug in this piece of code, right? So if you see this, I created an object of student2, but I didn't change my variable name here, right? So we have to change the variable name here as well. So I'll say student2 dot get information, and I'll just hold on to the console till I press enter, right? So let's just run this application. So name of the student is Tom, student is 21 year old, and their ID is this, blah, 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 right? So the same thing has been printed out for both of my students. Okay. So we have created how we can, we have seen like how we create classes in C#, right? And class just represent any specific thing that you want to simulate in your program. So in this case, we created a simple student class. It had few properties and a method, right? And from that main class, I created two objects of this class, then set the properties for those objects, and then I called the get information method from that particular object. Okay. So we'll just see one more thing about a class. So there's something called as a constructor. of a class, and I think about a constructor as the I don't know, the default method that would get executed whenever you create an object of that class. So let's take an example. So let's first see like how do we define a constructor, right? So the name of the constructor, basically the constructor method, would be the same as the name of the class. It has to be same, right? If you define something else, give it another name, it's actually another method, right? It would not run whenever you create a object. So you have to explicitly call that method then. So in this case, this is the default constructor. Basically means that whenever an object of this class would be created, this method would be called. So I'll do something simple here. So I'll just say console.writeLine called constructor executed. So you can do anything, right? So usually we use a constructor, basically the default constructor, to set default values for the properties, right? Which is holding data for this particular object. So for example, let's say if I know somebody who's instantiating a class or creating an object of this class, they forgot to put in the name of this class, then in that case, in the default constructor, what you might want to do is you want to put a dummy name, right, for that particular student. So this is an example of a default constructor. Let's run this application. So now what should happen is whenever you create this student one, basically object of student class, and also student two, that default constructor should get executed, and it should print out default constructor executed on the screen. So let's run this application again. So default constructor executed, then we were calling that method get information of for student one, and default constructor executed for student two, and then we are calling the method again. Okay, so this is an example of a default constructor. Similarly, we can also create something called as a parameterized constructor, right? And parameterized constructors, they are like very important. So, and no, there are like various things that you can do using a parameterized constructor. So what I can do is, so string, I can create a parameterized constructor with these three parameters. So I can say string ID, right? So in this case, I'll say this dot name equals to name that was passed. Okay, this dot age is to age, this dot ID equals to ID. Now, so I see an error here, right? This is because the type of this property is integer, and I was using a string here, so I'll just probably change this to an integer. Okay, so this is an example of a parameterized constructor. Now because this class has both constructors, now I can still do this and set the properties explicitly. Okay, but if you see, if I comment this line, right, basically if I comment the default constructor, I should actually see a compile time error here, right, saying that there is no argument given that correspond to the required formal parameter name, blah blah blah, whatever. Okay, so the thing is, if you explicitly create a parameterized constructor in a class, in that case there is no definition of a default constructor. But if you do not have a default constructor or even any other constructor, there is the default constructor is actually provided by the runtime, right? It's actually, it doesn't do anything, but there's a default constructor. But if you create any other constructor, it actually removes that default constructor, correct? So then you cannot just construct this object without actually passing these three parameters. Okay, so now what would happen is, in this particular case, I cannot set the properties. I mean, I can set up the properties explicitly, but I have to provide them at the type of creation of that object, right? So I can say this comma 21. Just copy this here. Oh, this is not needed. right? So I'll just remove this one for now. We'll just call it as probably one time, right? So this is an easier way, right? This is a cleaner way to construct an object because all you need to create this object is actually given the constructor itself. So, okay, so the same thing, right? Now I should expect we should expect the same output given by get information method. So name of the student is blah, 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 right? There's no default constructor. In this case, the constructor that is being called is the parameterized constructor. Okay, so that's all I wanted to cover in this session of fundamentals of classes in C#. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.